My apologies for having a double stutter here. We're starting show number 364 for this week in hospitality marketing. Sorry for the restutter. We are talking about the super fun stuff of getting ready for budget season 2023. We have been building up to this topically for the past few weeks into talking about defining feeder markets, defining the data sources used for your demands, creating persona marketing, identifying your competitive set and tools to use it. Our podcast has ghosted a lot of what we've been doing in the sense that we have paralleled the discussion, not only recapping our live show, but also talking about specific tools that do specific functions based on the topic of that particular podcast. Like, how do you get data and how do you determine feeder market with the data and so forth? We talked about why pace and trend is more important than real time ROI. So we have a defining measurable metric associated with the discussion of budgets. So we're up to this point where we're going into literally next week is August. August is usually the unofficial start of budget season for hospitality. And yes, we're one of those unique industries that we actually have a season for budget development. With that, there's a lot of preemptive work that gets done in August in preparation for the more robust discussions of budgets and forecasts. If anyone's not familiar with the sequence or you're new to a role that you are now a participant in the budgeting process for your property, usually there's an aggregation of historical data that is happening or will be happening starting next week. Kind of the dusting of the shelves of getting data from a variety of sources of performances from the past couple of years, and then determining the stacks of piles of data. Data usually gets into categories similar of content related to revenue management, marketing, operations. That's the three piles that begin to get developed over here in the next few weeks. Operations about operational expenses, departmental changes, any things that they dealt with from a cost perspective in the past 12 months since the last time they started the budgeting and forecasting of 2022 last year, to determine whether or not it was at or variable to what they had anticipated. If there's any new discoveries of potentials of things that they need to worry about, like capital expenses and so forth, that's the aggregation of content related to operational budget considerations that we're rolling into for August. From a revenue management perspective, is a lot of weight goes to them because usually the first questions associated with budgeting is related to top line revenue expectations, both historical and anticipated, forecasted. For that reason, revenue managers begin to gather their historical revenue management when I read data. And when I say that kind of data, I'm referring to specifically to things like all of your running occupancies, all of your running ADRs, all your running length of stays, um, all of your forecasts as they relate to forecasted versus actual versus budget. You have three numbers that most revenue managers work with in tandem perpetually through their process daily. And that is what was budgeted, what was forecasted, and what actually happened. Those strings of data, synchronous as they are, have variations. Sometimes what you had budgeted was some things can become unexpected. Maybe whether it was a group that came in that you hadn't anticipated, changing your metrics for a particular time frame. It might have been a circumstance or an event, weather related or what have you, positive or negative, that created a variance to what you had anticipated for that timeline from a budgeting perspective, and it changed the forecast potential because of that, the impact of it. Which of course resulted in the actualization change, what you actually did in comparison to your forecast and your budget. So revenue management has a very early on responsibility in the budgeting discussion as to what they put together for data. Third category we're talking about is marketing. Marketing comes to the table with all of the information that they can gather from their historical measurement of all the activities that they have been doing from two sources. It sounds like I'm air quoting, but two sources. Those two sources are organic and paid campaigns. If you're not a branded hotel, and I say this with the caveat because branded hotels, you don't have as much data to get from the brand. They don't share as many organic metrics about your section of the mothership to the brand. You're left a little blind as to some of the organic value data for marketing. If you're not brand, you have more data. You have more of your website's activity, more of your social media activity. And then, of course, all of your paid campaigns that you're running, same scenario, branded versus unbranded. Branded hotels, you're given a very watered down, vanilla, highlighted report at best. that just shows production of the efforts without very much data associated with who bought, where they bought, when they bought, the metrics of their engagement, total conversions based on spend. You don't get those kind of metrics from the brand reporting. You can certainly try to borrow in and drive it down and be the squeaky wheel and try to get more metric data from them, but it's usually met with indifference, and or they just don't have somebody sitting in the chair on the other side of the conversation quite yet. They're still trying to ramp up their bandwidth of people internally. So with all of that, non-branded hotels have the best advantage going into budgeting season because they have more data to review. Now, we're going to focus on the non-branded conversation right now so you understand the variances of all the data that can come through this. You have, for instance, your social media metrics organically. You have your historical way of looking at all the engagements that occurred through your organic content that you presented on your social media platforms, whichever ones you're participating in, most likely Facebook, alternatives past that. Um, and then you have your insights to that, which is once you see the raw numbers of I made a post, how many people saw it, how many people commented on it, how many people shared it. That's incrementally the values associated with those. What were those times that they were done? Were they correlated with a particular event that we can now look at from a math point of view of revenue generation from them and create those correlations? But right now, we're just putting data into piles. So you're going to look at that kind of data for social. From an organic website perspective, a little bit more robust. You're going to have where did they come into the website? Where did they look for things on the website? How much of each of the pages from the funnels? And if you're not familiar with Google Analytics, which is I'm assuming by default most of the people out there would be using them, be using it, where you can follow the flow of where did they come into our website? What did they do once they get into our website? And how many of those people that came through our website actually converted into a transaction because you're following the tracking into your booking engine. And there you get to see the result of the traffic that went through your website. Same too with your advertisement. With proper tracking, they come either if you're pushing them to your direct booking engine. I give the scrunchy face because there's very few instances where that's actually the better move. More often, the best move of any ad campaign is to drive them to our organic page that has an expanded perspective of content related to the action request of the ad itself. The ad can't fulfill all the content, so it drives you to a page that does. That being said, that traffic of that ad going to a page is measurable. You can see your ad going to your page. So you have a traffic number. Once on that page, you have a flow number from where they came from that page. Did they actually go and book it? Did they go around the rest of the website before booking? That traffic process, you create what's called goals and events in your website to measure the successes. You track that person as a goal that they went there. And then as an event, did they actually click on a booking engine? And then from there, your tracking in your booking engine determines whether it actually converted or whether there was a cart abandonment, how far did they go? And if you're really being good at marketing, you create a retargeting campaign, a triggering sales funnel that says they went this far. Let's see what they were connected to, and then we retarget them. So don't try to get off on the variations. These are marketing strategies, but they are related to your budgeting process when it comes to how do you gather this data. This is the data points that you're wanting to become more familiar with so that the next phase of the budget conversation is about refining what you know into action items of what you're going to do. So right now we're aggregating the data. So marketing is gathering their organic versions of their data for the platforms they've been engaged with, social and organic websites and what have you, and their marketing data, their information related to what their ad campaigns generated and the traffic relationships associated with them, which we just discussed. That's great. Those are piles. There's also other sources of data that marketers need to now take on their shoulders that historically hasn't been a part of the conversations for most places. And that is interpretive data, data that is coming from sources that are related to your feeder markets, your personas of people that come in through the seasonality demands of those types of people. Like you have families come in during the summer, you have non-family members during the fall, or they come for particular events, or they come for particular business cycle pushes. Like this is leaf season, so people will come into our market because that whatever those seasonal pushes are, Florida for spring and so what have you. These seasonal pushes, there's personas, people that you anticipated coming in based on the demographics they represented. That data has to get accumulated because you need to understand if did it validate your assumptions as to whom you were coming in the door, and that assumption turned into a marketing strategy, and that strategy has resultants. So you're looking at, did we figure out who was coming in the door? Did we target them correctly? If so, what is the success metrics associated with our targeting? Did we do what we said we're going to do in our historical marketing strategies? That data has to get shifted over to our discussions for budget 2023, because that's the interpretation of understanding how we can then push the business demands that we are trying to budget for 2023. Can we replicate what we did, improve on what we did, or abandon what we did for lack of production? That's the three choices we have in the marketing strategy by aggregating this data. That lends itself to the roundtable discussion between operational costs and operation management as to whom they should budget for. How many people do we need to clean rooms? How many people do we need to fix things based on business level? To revenue management's expectation of where they can optimize the opportunity for revenue. To the market's answer as to what we're going to do to influence that revenue that we need based on the revenue management's strategy. That's the triad of conversation that exists in a budget conversation. Okay. Because all of that gets put together and it goes up to the people that write the checks. You need to convince them that you have a sound triad relationship, that you're not asking for more operational value dollars to be spent than you're actually generating revenue to compensate for. You can show the strategy of how you're planning on getting that revenue, and you're showing the strategy of how to action items to generate the revenue. That's the three key components that are always a persistent question in budget discussions. I've had the pleasure of sitting in every chair in the budget discussion. I have been from the property level at every department level, including GM, including regional, including brand, everything. And then I've flipped the coin and I've been on the ownership sides where we've been sitting and trying to disseminate the value of what the property is trying to say it's going to be able to do. Sift the chief from the weight, the wheat, so to speak, as to what they're fluffing versus what they truly actually need, and go through the process of discovery together with the property to come to an equitable, manageable, affordable budget for upcoming year. Because what often doesn't get known from the property side or those people that are sitting facing up with asking for money is that there is a fine dance in the background for those people with the decision process. If they had unlimited funding, there would be no discussion. It'd be like, whatever you think is going to be, as long as you can show you make the money, here's the cash, here's the cash, here's your cash. They have to balance, from an ownership perspective, the cash flows necessary for operation. To put it in equitable terms, they need to make sure that when payrolls due and you have to cut checks for your staff members, there's money in the account, real money in the account for those checks to cash. In order to have that proper cash flow, you need to make sure your accounts receivable are ahead of your accounts payable. You need to ensure that you're not, it's not a matter of how much money you have in the bank. Money sitting in the bank from the ownership perspective is wasted money. It should be making money. So money is often regulated to other operations in a fundable way so that it's constantly making money. There only until recently, with the inflation impact that we've had on our economy, has there been bank accounts that actually make interest. It has been a zero option game to have money in a savings account. Same too for businesses. They also carry debt. Affluent people, rich people that own businesses, do not often use their own money. Now, they've had to create an inception to create the credit to get the loan to run businesses. So there is an equitable value that they had to start somewhere. But people that own businesses are not writing a check out of their personal account. One, they buffer themselves from the businesses by creating an LLC or a separate entity for the business. So there's the liability separation, obviously, from personal values, personal assets. But more importantly, they leverage the ability to get credit to get the money from a bank who has a note that's carried for the business. The business is the asset to fund the function of acquisition of the business and the maintenance of the business. So from their perspective, sitting and listening to budgets, they're looking for what's called reasonable expense. Is it something that, if spent, has either two impacts: improvement to the guest, which improves business, or improvement to the asset, which improves value? It's two choices. That's it. That's the driving forces associated with allowing budgets to get funded. Because a budget is a document that's used in their discussion with their banks. They too answer to people. Now, in different circumstances, they don't have the same parent-child relationship that you do with a property. They have a fiduciary obligation financially to the institution that lent them money for the asset to validate their practice of business operations, to make the bank feel that there is no reason for them to question the note that they're carrying and the ability to say it's their asset through the operation that has been run by the owners that are running it. So, for that reason, budgets are a tendered document. This is our budget. And the banking team will at times review the financial process of a budget to ensure that it is running in real numbers, that it's not artificially created, that there's artificial expenses or there's artificial revenues that would jeopardize the security that they have in letting that note run for the property. So that's the tiering of budgets that go on. You may think from a property, like, why can't they give me money for air conditioners? I'm constantly spending this much money on repairing them. Why can't we just replace them with new ones? Because in the wash of things, the dollars spent in maintenance of the air conditioners as a financial impact and the overall amount of cash or finances necessary to replace all of them, it's more affordable from a debt relationship not to spend the additional funding for the new air conditioners, instead eat the inflated cost of maintaining them. Even though a property is logically thinking, why would you pay twice as much to get them always maintained when if we get new ones, we lower our maintenance costs? Because the cost ratio of funding the money necessary to buy the new ones doesn't work out in balance to everything else. The operational cost of just paying for its maintenance. It sounds weird, but sometimes spending more saves you money because of how or what that money actually is. If it's actually full liquidity money or whether it's leveraged operational expenses. And you'll find that a lot in budgets as you go forward. For those that are new to the budget world, is that sometimes a line item, and line items, so people understand that you have departmental categorizations in a budget. You have the sales office, or you have the engineering department, or you have product maintenance, or you have landscape, or whatever, a proper property asset value and so forth. You have different categories, and each company has their own segmentations. It's not as if there's a standard. Well, there are standardizations, but there's a lot of fragmentations. There's a familiarity to certain segments, but then there's a lot of odd ways that some companies re-identify sections within those to make it hide stuff. Let's put it that way. So line items are items identified categorically, like let's take the sales office, trade shows and conventions. It's a line item. It says we anticipate that on a 12-month calendar, at this month and this month, we're going to spend $1,500 or $2,000 for a sales member to either go to a sales conference or trade show or convention, or that we pay to participate in and represent ourselves in it. Like a salesperson might want to make sure that they are part of the annual wedding conference in their area, where all the wedding venues, yours being one of them, gets to showcase what they offer to all the brides to be. Usually happens in June. A lot of brides running around, for next year, what have you. Actually, February too. There's too high. I mean, anyway, digress. And there's a cost to be a part of it. You have to pay for the booth space. You have to pay for all the people, staffers, laborers, and so forth. So that's a budgeted amount. It's calculated by the sales team in this budget seasonal process that we're talking about. And that line item said that it's going to cost us roughly this much in March or February and this much in June. Say it's $5,000 total. Okay. That line item is there. Now, in the budget discussion with ownership granting financial approval of the proposed budget from the property, and they question that line item because last year it was $3,500. So there's a variance that flags them, because that's what usually happens is they see last year's compared to this year's and they see variance numbers. This is a percentage variance compared to last year's budget. This is up 7%, or this is down 2%, or this is up 15%. And those get flagged right away. As soon as you see high variances, that's an immediate question that comes up in budgeting. Like, okay, why is this different than it was last year? Now, we have a lot of those line items for last year to this year because of the pandemic's impact on our actual expenses versus anticipated businesses this year. So we are going to have a lot of these questions come up, but I'm talking more of a historical average. And those questions have to get answered. Why are you spending $5,000 compared to $3,500 this year? Well, we're going to go to February where we didn't go before. We're going to get a bigger booth in February than we have done historically, or this is our first year back since not doing it 2 years in a row or something like this. And unless that's when the question comes up, so what do you think you're going to get from this? Well, that's when the good budget discussion says, well, we in Smurf business for weddings do a XK dollar amount. Okay. And this contributes to that XK dollar amount by this percentage, or we usually get this much business because we're at this conference. And we get a list of people that were there, which gives us a great mail list market that we get X dollar value from. That's how you answer budget questions with why is it this way? You explain the purpose of the variance and then justify it for the value proposition that it represents. Same too goes for properties. When you're discussing properties, why are we buying $2,000 more in paint every month? Well, because we're not redoing the fascia of XYZ common areas, it is necessary for us to increase our paint schedule because if we don't, it looks rather tattered and torn, and it diminishes the sellability when we're showcasing the common space for group bookings, common space bookings, that it looks worn and tired. The paint will at least keep it fresher looking, but it's going to cost us more because we have to increase the frequency of painting. This is the discussion process associated with these types of line item discussions. Progressively, what happens in a budget discussion, which usually happens around the end of September, beginning of October, is you have overview discussions that are pretty much top line departmental categorizations. Hey, GM sitting in a chair in front of us, ownership asking questions, or your exec team. We see your sales department is up 4% in total expense. Can you describe to us what is the overview of why that is happening? And it might be we're bringing that administrative assistant that we hadn't had before because of the demand load for it. We feel like that will improve our efficiency of the office. As you can see, our sales team is tasked with a 10% increase in total revenue. We need them to have the support team necessary. That's a departmental level, high level. That's the chunk of wonka ones that first happen. Then once those have been ascertained as to being understood, they're not been approved necessarily at that point, but they've been understood. Then depending upon the engagement of the people from the ownership perspective, they begin to get granular with, well, why are you? I notice your line item within sales, that you're going to trade shows and conventions, you're up by $5,000. What is from 3,500 to 5,000? Why particularly that interest? And then we go back to the discussion we just had as to the variances that might explain that. That's the next level of granularity. All of these operational expenses, conversations, everything we just discussed about departmental and line item stuff is not happening until later in the budget season. The first thing that's happening now, as of July 29th, going into August 1st of 2022 for the 2023 discussion, is the aggregation of data to determine top line revenue. That's first step. What do we mean by top line revenue? Top line revenue is the total assumption of gross dollars coming into the business. Has nothing to do with what we just said about budgetary expenditures of that money. Okay, flow through is another way of referring to that. Okay, down to the EBITDA line, earnings before income taxes, amortization, depreciation. That's the only thing that an operation can control down to. Below that line of expenses is ownership control. How much debt structure do they have to pay? What is capitalization? Not controllable from an operational budget, not controllable from a property level budget. That is controlled from an ownership perspective. All they can control down to is EBITDA, okay? Because they can't control taxes, they can't control those things, okay? So what we're doing now, come August, is departmentally 3 departments: operation, revenue management, marketing. Operation is beginning to review their historical expenses as related to their anticipated budget versus actuals. And they're beginning to garner a war chest of interest of what they think they're going to be needing to look at operationally come 2023. We have learned that we need item 1, item 2, item 3, item 4, or position 1, position 2, whatever that they're beginning now as of August to aggregate that type of information together. Revenue management is beginning to take their historical data, as mentioned, on their past occupancies, past ADRs, past revenues, their information about their historical performance based on segmentations of corporate traveler versus group traveler versus Smurf versus consortia. They're segmenting and defining their historical productivity. And the first thing that they are doing, especially from the group side, actually almost exclusively to the group side in many ways, is repeatable business. From the sales team, in their perspective, they're immediately looking at their entire overall annual review and striking through every non-repeatable piece of business. It's not coming back. That was a one-time thing. That was a wedding. Not going to get married again this year. Not those people anyway. That's not coming back. Um, that was the Super Bowl. We're not having the Super Bowl in our location this year. Not coming back. Those types of things, okay, is what they're striking through. They're also creating another list other than the strike throughs that is all about the repeatable business. Yes, we should be able to re-sign that contract for that corp business, that L&R business, local negotiated rate. Yes, we can keep those on the board. Or, and it's not just as simply as black and white where it's like, oh, they're definitely coming back. There's gradients. There's high probability, low probability. They're literally defining, they're categorizing every piece of business they've done for the past 12 months into the categories of highly probable down to least probable, other than the non-repeatables. That's what they're doing right now. That's what every sales department is doing right now, is assessing repeatability. Because when the revenue management gathers their data and sales gathers their data, the first convening of that information is literally a purge. What isn't coming back? So we just take that off of top line revenue for those times. We have a 12-month board in front of us. Let's start. We put on the total last year numbers and we start cutting out the negatives that are non-repeatables. Boom. Then we'll put in the gradients of highly probable to least probable to know probability of business from group. That's defined because group is considered a contribution percentage for most of the hotels and not a dominant factor, which some hotels have. They're a contributing factor. That creates compression and displacement of what is available for transient. To be honest, transient can always displace group unless it's contract and under contract. So that's where we begin to create this warboard of what does transient need to carry that group isn't doing any more of, or how much is left for transient to push based on contractual annual obligations that we can't move, and transient only has this limited availability of inventory at that time. That's the numbers get used. Bulk numbers that often happen is, well, how many room counts are in your hotel? Multiply that by the calendar days within those particular months for 2023, and that is your gross inventory per month. That's the maximum you can sell, unless you want to build an extra room one night, which is often a fun joke about front desk people is, sure, we'll build an extra room even though we're sold out for you. It's one of those parables of being a front desk agent. So you have maximum inventory, which is your total inventory multiplied by the number of days for that. Yeah. And now you begin to have other influencing factors, like that at certain times of the year, for maintenance and improvement, or maybe capital expense and FF&E improvement and so forth, you might have inventory out of service during transitional processes. This is the time you begin to allocate when this is going to happen to have minimal impact on your sellability. You're not going to do it during peak demand. You're going to take revenue off the table because of it. You're going to do it in diminished demand where the impact may not be as profound. Sometimes it's unavoidable. It just is, depending on how your hotel is built, if it's built on stacks or layers. What I mean by that is that when you build a hotel by stack, every room of the same room number based on their floor has to be maintenance together because they're connected together. You can't fix the plumbing on the 6th floor without affecting the first floor of the same stack. Same too if it's built horizontally, where things feed per level, it's by floor that they get done. Not everything gets done certain ways. If you're painting, you might paint a floor. If you're carpeting, you might carpet a floor. You don't have to do it by stack all the time. But then if you're doing plumbing, lighting fixtures, HVAC or something like this, you might have to do it by stack. All of these things get put into this master calendar of, okay, August, we're going to be doing these floors. So inventory reduction is by these floor room counts. That's all part of the overall calculation of anticipated top line revenue strategy. Okay. That's where those things come from. So here you go into your budgeting process with revenue management looking at their gross numbers and making initial determination as to total anticipated group contribution in general and total transient contribution in general. This is where then marketing comes in and starts referring to the historical data that they have about source of business as it relates to the numbers that revenue is showing up as actuals from the past 12 months. Now, here's the rub. We're doing this in August of 2022. They left the back half of 22 has yet actually to be actualized. So you're looking at a backwards 12 months on actual 2021 and 2020. Half of your process is including a process from 2 years back. You have to take data of your forecast of 2022 this year as a part of the calculations in your budgeting process of 2023. That creates a higher variability. And what eventually happens doing this year in and year out is that you have a higher probability of accuracy for the first 6 months of the rolling year forward than you do of the last 6 months of the rolling year past. The reason that you have to make a very strong mid-year readjustment for current year is to solidify your forecasted numbers for this year and its use for budgeting next year. So let me explain what that means. We're in July of this year. We now have a much clearer picture of what the rest of this year looks like than we did this same time last year looking at 2022. Because of that, we need to refine our forecasts in line with our previously projected budget for this time of year and create variance values that then we then apply and where applicable. Some things are not because of, hey, last year at this time we thought we didn't know whether we'd be in business for 2022. Obviously, is a different benchmark than saying, wow, we're only off 4% from total gross revenues. We're doing pretty good with it, the fact that we anticipated the demand and we got the demand, or we marketed the demand and we got the demand. So a realignment of your actuals compared to last year's budget calculation for the remainder of this year. Those variables get used in the calculation of the impact for what you're budgeting for 2023, knowing you're going to do the same process again this time next year. Realign your budgeting forecast of the remainder of 2023 to actuals that you're better in tune with that time next year. As time goes forward, you get better with your accuracy. If you ask any revenue manager, they're brilliantly smart within the next 30 days. They're kind of smart in the next 60, and they're throwing darts after 90. Now, we have softwares and so forth that help in that process, and they're better at throwing darts. But the reality of it is that we're based on anticipated trend analysis, not necessarily on actualizations. There's not enough actualized bookings for us to have an accurate forecast. We have predictors, we have trends, we have pace, we have lots of tools that we can use to be as accurate as possible. But the reality of it is that if a weather storm comes through and wipes out your inventory, you may have had all the demand interest that you thought, but you have no inventory to sell them. You don't make the revenue that you said you're actually going to solidly make because of it. So never until it actually happens is actuals worth counting. Don't count your chickens before they hatch, so to speak. So here we are, July rolling into August. Talked about operations, looking at their historical, coming up with their anticipated. Talked about revenue management, looking at their total historicals as to all the numbers that they use to calculate their potentialities and their segmentations that they use, their contribution channels, or whether do we get that from OTAs, do we get that from direct channel, do we get that if you're a brand contribution or whatever, do you get that from email campaigns, do we get that from our group business, and if so, what segmentation of group business? You're laying the groundwork of understanding the perspectives of where your historical numbers are coming from. Marketing is looking at correlations of their efforts to the results and the actualizations of those efforts, the traffics, the conversion values, the sources of business, the value of those sources of business, the cost that it took to get that business, the amount of content they put up, and the relevancy in their attribution string as to how much of that content actually impacted the conversions that are measured in dollars that go to the bank. That's the process we're in right now. Towards the end of August, we'll be having discussions between, first off, revenue management and sales, then revenue management marketing, and then at the end of August, you'll have your early discussions of operations with anticipated top line revenues that revenue managers think we're going to be hitting. A lot of times, unfortunately, it's poorly influenced by owners who say, oh, we need to be up 10% in revenues next year. And what will happen is they'll create artificial numbers that are not based in reality. That 10% is not a real number. They don't know that they can actually get 10 more percent, but they want to project on a budget that they're going to share with the bank, which we already discussed, that they're planning on doing a 10% growth to solidify their financial relationships with the bank for reasons unknown to us property people, perhaps, which is unrealistic. And then we're constantly under the burden of underperforming because the budget was put too high under unrealistic expectations. That's the unfortunate influence that owners have for their own reasons. They may need those numbers to sell the bank the idea that they want another loan for another bank, and they need to show high profitability for the assets they already have. And so they make these unrealistic budgets that, hey, in 6 months when we have to adjust the budget, that's okay. But the bank gave us the loan we needed back then, so we're able to move forward with the other stuff. And It's a game that everybody plays. The problem is it impacts your sales team, who may be bonus based. They have unrealistic bonus goals. And because that they can't hit their bonus goals and they don't get their bonus money, which discourages them as a performance tool. You have people that are constantly berated for the lack of performance based on their budgeting request. So they feel like they're not succeeding when in fact they're doing exceptionally well with what they could be doing if it was more realistically based into their expectations, that they're the goals that they're being given. It has a very residual ripple effect that owners don't often pay attention to or just acknowledge as the cost of what they need it for. And that goes to why owners own hotels. If it's guest centric, where they're looking at the centricity of the source of business and giving the best guest experiences, or investment based, which is REITs and what have you, which is more about am I getting as yield for my financial investment, and the method of doing it, whether you burn a property out and run it into the ground and not reinvest in it so you can constantly get net flow from it. And then when it's done, sell it as an asset that somebody else has to worry about. Seen that all too often as well. Lots of work environments we are in when it comes to this type of business. So, come the end of August, we're going to start consolidating our conversations between the departments as to anticipated top line revenue and its impact on what operations thinks that they can operate as, what they'd like to shoot for and add, including into their operation, which is the flow through calculations of, okay, we have top line revenue. How does that translate into our operational expenses? And then you have marketing trying to assess based on the revenue goals that revenue management is looking to do and what our ownership is asking them to do. How does that influence their true objectivity of being able to actually generate that revenue through their efforts? If they're being asked to double the results of a marketing campaign when they know that it's not double the opportunity there, they're destined to fail. So having the data of traffic, having the data of cost of conversion, having the data of conversions allows the marketing people to math out, you may want twice as much revenue, but there's not enough audience there for what we're doing to generate twice as much revenue. That's the real conversations that have to happen. The reality of budgeting, unfortunately, boils down to who gets stuck with the bag of poop when the music stops. If marketing overcommits their capability of generating revenue, revenue management gets to do the Pontius Pilate and say, hey, they said they could do it. I gave them the goal that you told me to give them, and they said they can do it. Gets revenue management off the hook. Then operations just bemoans the fact that they don't have the money to spend, which means that they can then say, well, if we couldn't paint those common rooms because you didn't give us the money for the paint, what did you expect? And if the paint's peeling, nobody's going to want to rent the room. Everybody has an excuse, except for marketing, which is that, overcommitted themselves. So you get a lot of humming and hawing and making sure that what I call deniable culpability, close enough to take credit, far enough away from the blast to not get blamed. And that's where the budget dances start coming in. Well, if you get this, then I can do this. Conditional relationships, operations. Well, if you give me that paint, I can paint the rooms, which is going to make sure people are going to rent them because we're going to cover up all the bad stuff. Obviously, if they don't get the paint, they can't paint the rooms, they're off the hook. If revenue management goes and say, hey, ownership told me they wanted up 10% and I put it in there knowing we'd only get 6% at our best, then they're off the hook. If marketing says, look, there's not enough volume of business for what you want to double in revenue for that time segment because historically this is the most we can get out of these segments that we're pursuing, then marketing's off the hook. And that's the dance that happens with budget. Who's not on the hook for the problem that is there? Because if you are on the hook that you said and didn't do, then that gives you the ability to get kicked out of your chair, so to speak. Ownership can blame you and say, well, you didn't do what you said you're going to do, performance issue, you're on jeopardy and or you're out. And that's what people are trying to avoid. So you have a lot of obscuring of things from each department. It's called sandbagging. Salespeople sandbag by knowing they have more business potential than what they're saying they can do, so that when they bring all this extra business in, they look like rock stars and they get the benefit of their bonus or whatever have you. So they underestimate their value performance and knowing that they're going to be able to bring more to the table for that time frame. That's sandbagging. The reverse of it is bad in the sense that they think they're going to get more business than they can actually get, and they fall short. Marketing, overly optimistic about their performance capabilities if given the budget to do so. Well, if I only had more money, we probably could have get that number. Not unless you really mathed it out to know that you could. For instance, if you're looking at a total saturation of voice of 65% and up, in a given market for a given campaign, and you're running good conversion, let's say it's 3.0, click-through rate of 3%, um, you're looking at the fact that it might cost you more money with less return if you get up to 70% voice, but now your click-through rate goes down to 1.9, or just even say 2.0 to keep round numbers. Your value goes down. You may have made more money, but it costs you twice as much money to make it. That value relationship runs the gamut that marketing can sometimes generate numbers at an expense that it wasn't worth it. Because, in all honesty, expenses associated with the generation of top line revenue should always land in or close to your net profit ratio. You should always be relatively close to that, because in the world of overall perspective of resource, you don't want to cost more than it takes to actually make the product. And this goes to, your EBITDA line and so forth. Sometimes you do spend more money to get the business than it is to have the value of the business, but that's cash flow decisions. I need the dollar in my account to make payroll. Granted, it cost me almost that dollar to make it, but I have that dollar to spend. And that's where you do cash flow marketing calculations. How much top line cash flow can I create, regardless of the overall cost to generate? And that goes to conversations of ROI versus total percentage contribution. When you look at marketing initiatives, you need to look at what the KPI is. What is our total goal? Our total goal is to make 350 or 400,000 this month in total top line revenue. Great. What channels are we looking at to generate that 400,000? And generally speaking, you have OTA channels, walk-ins, groups, blah, 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 and then individual segments and with them and so forth, direct channel, online campaigns or online books, direct bookings versus emails versus call-ins, whatever. All of them have a percentage contribution to that $400,000 you're trying to generate that month. Where can we make variations to those so they can increase their contribution? Because a lot of times they fall short. Well, if you actually ask the marketers, like, what do you think is going to be in generation? Well, we historically did um, $50,000 for that month. So out of the $400,000 that you need, you're doing an eighth of that. Okay. Well, if we look at all the other the departments of contribution percentage expectations, which is budgeting, forecasting in that particular circumstance against your budget, you might find that you're short $20,000. How can we make up that 20,000? Can the direct channel that is contributing anticipated $50,000 go up past the 50,000? If so, how much does it cost to do that? Some may decide to spend the money because they can push it up, and even though it costs them more, they hit their revenue goal. Or they can say it's going to cost too much to push that channel up. Is there another channel that we can use that can push the top line revenue for us to have that isn't as expensive? That's where channel costs come in. OTAs cost you 14 to 16, 18 to 22% perhaps to generate the revenue, but it generates top line revenue. And the cost of it gets buried into a department that doesn't have a budget for it, which is the commissions. That's why people love using it, because it's not taking out of their budget, it's a cost of business. So the 15, 18, 22%, whatever that they have to pay in commissions is a check they write for that top line revenue. And nobody questions it, even though it costs them a lot of money to do that, compared to direct channel, where it costs you a budgeted amount. And in order to get that contribution up, you have to break your budget to do that. And that raises a whole mess of alarm bells with a lot of people, including ownership. Like, why are you going to spend more money than we told you could spend? No, don't do that. And we're like, well, look, it's cheaper for us to do it than it is for you to pay the OTA check. And it's like, yeah, but the OTA check doesn't actually negative impact our budget. So let them do it, even though it costs more. You see how these rationales work in the budgeting process and in the daily life process of which channels contribute. But all of this dance of this for budgets are now. This is when these things start to happen. And right now we're in the process of data aggregation. We'll progress into data comparison. We'll progress into data interpretation, and then methodology and functionality for endorsement and authorization. That's the process of the business cycle for budgets for hospitality. So don't want to keep beating a horse on this. Don't want to also make it where it's a continually repetitive conversation. And I don't want to make it sound like I'm biased as to how the process goes. There's good and bad components to the budgetary process. The reality of it is that the more honest you are about the data that you have, to justify the cause of your decisions, the more secure you are in this blame game, who's responsible thing, because you're bringing data to justify a perspective. And so, data, good data, bad data, whatever you can say that, but data is data. It's the interpretation of the data that goes good or bad. Data is data. As they say, statistics are made up by people all the time to their favor, and it truly is. If you bring in a report that you only take the data statistic that you want that validates your position on it, ignoring the vast amount of statistics that don't. But if the people that you're presenting to don't know they exist, they listen to the argument from the affirmation that you have data to support it. A good budgeting process vets itself before it gets in front of those people to question it. Before your budget from your property gets advanced upwards, it needs to go through the acid bath test of how much bullshit is in this thing. How many things are we saying we're guessing pretty solid, or versus we're solid? Um, and those need to be known by the budgeting presenting committee. The people, usually the exec team, maybe just the GM, whatever, that goes up to ownership to present their budget proposal, needs to know where there's leaky water, and they need to know where it's a little fluffied, and they need to know where there's a question mark to it, because they're the ones that are on the spot. Because unfortunately, within budget dialogue, as soon as there's a suspicion of doubt, it casts shadow on everything. That even though it may be just one thing that there's an uncertainty of the presenter on, it casts doubt on everything the presenter is in collaboration with because of it. So it's a very pivotal point to make sure that you are solid in your perspective, you're solid in your understanding, and you're clear on the supporting evidence that justifies why you're proposing what you're proposing. I can't give that advice enough to anybody who goes into the budget cycle. And no matter how good you think you are at smoke and mirrors, there's somebody better than you that can see through smoke and mirrors. I can always tell you that. I've been amazed at some people that can see through the clutter and cut to the core so concisely for something that you sit back and go, wow, I did not see that. And they did. So please know there's always a smarter person in the room, and that person in the room that's smarter usually is the one you're asking permission for. So plan accordingly, be honest with your data, and know your data thoroughly to know how to explain it in a way that does not cast doubt. So we will probably touch on more budget conversations over the coming weeks of the show, given the fact that we are going to be in the middle of the season progressively. So we'll probably touch places. And I think I'm also going to bring in some people that are very fluent in this discussion from a variety of perspectives: revenue management, marketing, operations, that can give insight into the processes associated with budgeting. So I thank you very much for the privilege of your time today. Thank you, everyone that joined us on the simulcast that I was a little slow in starting today, about a minute behind when we started the live show. So I appreciate that, and appreciate you putting up with my duplication of intros. If you have questions about what I've talked about, or you want more insight to things, or you feel like there's something that was missed in the conversation, please reach out to me at lauren@hospitalitydigitalmarketing.com. I answer each and every email for both the live show and the podcast. Our podcast will be similar in context to some things, more specifically to tools, and that we can function with. I think what we're doing today, hold on, podcast for today. We're talking about analytics and transformations for tracking, which is a secondary conversation to our budgets, in the sense that this is the sourcing of information that you use within the budgeting process. But we're going to talk about the transition of what GA is doing now to what GA is going to be doing, and the timeline that Google has implemented. So that'll be in our podcast discussion today. And we'll talk about some tools that are already out in the market that will help you first in identifying GA4 into your program and creating a parallel for your analytics, and then advancing it to actually creating the triggers and the tags that you need within GA4 to get more accurate information in your decision process and in its own way towards your budgeting process. So we'll talk about that in the podcast today as well. For everyone, thank you for the privilege of your time again. And to note that we will recast this show in a more convenient time zone slots, 11:30 a.m. Wednesday for Sydney, Australia time for our APAC friends, and 11:30 a.m. London time for our EU friends, so that you can catch a little more convenient time for you, rather than the very oddball times that we run with the 11:30 a.m. Eastern US time in those particular time zones. And of course, we always translate it to 11 languages based on the countries of origin that watch us the most. Out of the 25,000 plus that watch us each week, thank you so very much. Always, you can catch us on Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter on a variety of pages and platforms within those, but also more importantly into our TV channel that you can find on Roku, Amazon Prime, Google TV, Apple Plus. You can find, just look for the Hospitality Channel. The live show is always on the free side of that. There is a payment gateway for additional content, $4.99 a month. I welcome you to sign up for it because we have some really cool content on the other side of that. And of course, we have a software and services free side to the TV channel as well that highlights a lot of software and services that do a lot of the function stuff that we talk about in the daily operations for hospitality. So hopefully you'll look at those as well for those that are on it. So with that, again, my name is Loren Gray. We look forward to talking to you next Friday at 11:30 a.m. Eastern US time for show number 365. Until then, have a great, wonderful day and a great, wonderful weekend. And for those watching us in different time zones, same thing for a wonderful day. Take care. Bye now.
Remember back last year about this time, there were cruise ships that couldn't come into dock anywhere because they wouldn't let them. You're infected and we don't want you.
Yeah, no, it's true to that. I think also too is that we from a marketing side of things, for all that's going on with the